The most terrifying mask in horror history cost less than a cup of coffee today, and the man who made it famous was paid pocket change to wear it. Behind Michael Myers' iconic look lies a bizarre tale of cigarette smoke, back pockets, early 70s work clothes, and rejected presidential faces. From the clown costume that almost was to the vintage coveralls that sparked decades of debate, the creation of horror's blankest stare involved stranger decisions than you'd ever imagine. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Michael Myers' mask and overalls from Halloween 1978. Fact 1. The mask cost only $1.98. When production designer Tommy Lee Wallace walked into a costume shop on Hollywood Boulevard in 1978, he had one simple task: find a mask for the killer in John Carpenter's new horror movie called Halloween. The budget for the entire film was only $300,000, which meant there was absolutely no money available to create a custom mask from scratch, so Wallace needed to find something cheap and ready-made that could work right off the shelf. What he ended up purchasing would become one of the most recognizable faces in horror history, and it cost less than $2. The Captain Kirk mask that Wallace chose was priced at just $1.98, which sounds incredibly cheap even by 1970s standards. To put that in perspective, if you adjust for inflation, that same mask would cost around $9.78 in today's money, which is still shockingly inexpensive for what would become such an iconic piece of cinema history. For comparison, the highest-paid actor in the film, Donald Pleasance, earned $20,000 for his role, while the mask that would terrify audiences for decades cost less than what you'd pay for a sandwich. The fact that such a cheap, mass-produced item became the face of one of horror's greatest villains is almost impossible to believe when you consider how much thought usually goes into creating memorable movie monsters. Wallace bought the mask from a random costume shop, not from a specialized effects studio or prop house, and it was just sitting on a shelf alongside other generic Halloween masks. Nobody involved in the production could have predicted that this bargain bin purchase would still be frightening people more than 40 years later, or that replicas of it would eventually sell for hundreds of dollars to collectors and fans who want to own a piece of that terrifying legacy. Fact 2. It's actually Captain Kirk's face. The mask that Michael Myers wears throughout Halloween isn't just any random face. It's actually the face of William Shatner, specifically molded to look like his character Captain Kirk from the original Star Trek television series. The mask was originally manufactured in 1975 as official Star Trek merchandise, and it was created from an actual mold of Shatner's face that had been made for a 1975 horror film called The Devil's Reign. The Star Trek makeup department had originally used this mold to apply prosthetics and other special effects to alter Shatner's appearance for various roles, and then someone later used that same mold to create mass-produced Captain Kirk masks that were sold in costume shops across the country. What makes this even stranger is that the mask wasn't chosen because anyone wanted Michael Myers to look like William Shatner or Captain Kirk. Production designer Tommy Lee Wallace picked it purely because it had a blank, featureless quality that felt unsettling and emotionless, which was exactly what director John Carpenter wanted for the character. In fact, when Wallace brought the mask back to show Carpenter, nobody on set was thinking about Star Trek at all. They just saw a plain white face that looked creepy and inhuman after it was modified. The mask sat on store shelves as a Captain Kirk costume piece before Wallace found it, and it would have stayed that way if the Halloween production team had chosen one of the other options they were considering. William Shatner himself had absolutely no idea that his face was being used for one of horror's most famous villains, and the mask manufacturer certainly never imagined their Captain Kirk product would end up representing pure evil instead of a heroic starship captain. The connection between Star Trek's optimistic future and Halloween's embodiment of terror is completely accidental, but it's become one of the most fascinating pieces of movie trivia in horror history. Fact 3. 4 masks were tested, including Nixon. When Tommy Lee Wallace went shopping for Michael Myers' mask, he didn't just grab the first thing he saw and call it a day. He actually came back with 4 completely different options for director John Carpenter and the crew to choose from. The selection included the Captain Kirk mask that eventually became iconic, a Mr. Spock mask also from Star Trek, a mask of former United States President Richard Nixon, and a sad clown mask designed to look like Emmett Kelly, who was a famous circus performer from the early 1900s known for his melancholy hobo clown character named Weary Willie. The fact that a presidential mask was even under consideration is particularly bizarre when you think about what Michael Myers represents in the film. Using Richard Nixon's face for a serial killer apparently never seemed like a good idea to anyone on set, and the Nixon and Spock masks were quickly dismissed because they were far too recognizable and would have distracted audiences from the character. People would have spent the entire movie thinking about politics or Star Trek instead of feeling genuinely frightened by this mysterious killer stalking babysitters on Halloween night. The Emmett Kelly clown mask was actually taken much more seriously as a potential choice, and the production team even tested it on camera to see how it would look. They added frizzy red hair to the clown mask to make it look more disturbing, and the idea behind choosing it had a specific narrative purpose. It would have created a visual connection to the opening scene of the film where young Michael Myers kills his sister Judith while wearing a clown costume. Despite the mask looking genuinely creepy and featureless during testing, Carpenter ultimately decided it wasn't quite right because he had given Wallace very specific instructions to find the plainest, most emotionless mask possible, and the Captain Kirk mask fit that description better than any sad clown ever could. Fact 4. The clown mask was almost chosen. The Emmett Kelly sad clown mask came incredibly close to becoming the face of Michael Myers, and the production team was seriously torn between using it and the Captain Kirk mask that eventually won out. The clown option wasn't just a random choice from the costume shop, it actually had deep thematic significance that connected directly to the opening scene of Halloween, where we see 6-year-old Michael Myers wearing a full clown costume on Halloween night in 1963 when he murders his older sister Judith with a kitchen knife. Having the adult Michael continue to wear a clown mask 15 years later would have created a powerful visual callback to that traumatic moment and emphasized the idea that he was still trapped in the mindset of that disturbed child. The specific mask they considered was a Don Post Studios Emmett Kelly mask, which depicted the famous sad-faced hobo clown character that was well known to audiences at the time. To make it even more unsettling, the production team added frizzy red hair to the mask and actually filmed test footage with someone wearing it to see how it would look on camera. According to people who were there during the testing, the modified clown mask looked genuinely demented and creepy, with a featureless quality that could have worked really well for creating an atmosphere of dread and terror. However, director John Carpenter had given Tommy Lee Wallace very specific instructions about what he wanted. The mask needed to be as plain and emotionless as possible, almost like a blank canvas that audiences could project their fears onto. While the sad clown mask was definitely frightening, it still had too much character and expression built into it, whereas the Captain Kirk mask had an almost inhuman blankness that made it feel more like a death mask than an actual face, which is exactly what Carpenter was looking for to represent pure, unexplainable evil. Fact 5. Shatner didn't know for years. William Shatner, the actor who played Captain Kirk on Star Trek and whose face became the template for the Michael Myers mask, had absolutely no idea that his likeness was being used in one of the most successful horror films of all time. For years after Halloween was released in 1978 and became a massive hit, Shatner went about his career completely unaware that his face had been transformed into the visage of a silent, unstoppable killer who terrified millions of moviegoers around the world. The truth only came out when Shatner was doing a routine interview years later, and someone casually mentioned to him that the Halloween mask was actually modeled after his face. His initial reaction was one of complete surprise and confusion, and he reportedly asked if they were joking because the whole thing seemed so unlikely and strange. When he later learned the full story about how the mask came to be, Shatner discovered that it all happened completely by accident. The production team for Halloween had simply bought a mass-produced Captain Kirk mask from a costume shop, modified it with paint and scissors, and never contacted him or sought any kind of permission because they were just using an off-the-shelf product that anyone could purchase. Since finding out about this unexpected connection between his Star Trek character and Michael Myers, Shatner has consistently said that he feels honored to be part of Halloween's legacy in this unusual way. He's acknowledged how amusing and ironic it is that Captain Kirk, a character who represents heroism and humanity's best qualities, ended up providing the face for one of cinema's most famous embodiments of pure evil. Shatner has never received any royalties or payments for the use of his likeness in this way, since the mask was created from a mold that was made for other purposes and then sold as generic merchandise. Fact 6. The mask was stored under a bed. After filming wrapped on the original Halloween in 1978, the iconic Michael Myers mask didn't end up in some carefully controlled studio archive or climate-controlled storage facility. Instead, producer Deborah Hill took it home and kept it in a shoebox under her bed for the next several years. This casual treatment of what would become one of the most famous props in horror movie history seems almost unbelievable today. But at the time, nobody had any idea that Halloween would become such a massive success or that there would ever be a sequel that needed the original mask. The mask sat there collecting dust under Hill's bed throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, just sitting in darkness like any other forgotten item that gets shoved under furniture and ignored. When the time came to make Halloween 2 in 1981, the production team retrieved the mask from its unlikely resting place and discovered that it had gone through some significant changes during its years of storage. The pristine white paint that had been sprayed on it for the first film had faded and degraded, and the mask had accumulated a noticeable layer of dust and grime from spending so much time in such an informal storage location. Hill kept the mask in a shoebox rather than any kind of protective case or container, which meant it was exposed to whatever environmental conditions existed under her bed over those years. The lack of proper storage also meant the mask got wrinkled and slightly misshapen from being stuffed into a confined space, and by the time it was brought back out for the sequel, it looked noticeably different from how it appeared in the first movie, though these changes actually ended up working in the film's favor by making Michael Myers look even more weathered and sinister. Fact 7. Cigarette smoke yellowed the mask. One of the strangest reasons why the Michael Myers mask looks noticeably different in Halloween 2 compared to the original film has nothing to do with intentional artistic choices or special effects. It's because producer Deborah Hill was a heavy smoker, and the mask spent years absorbing cigarette smoke while it sat in a shoebox under her bed. Hill smoked regularly in her home throughout the time period between 1978 and 1981, and all that smoke gradually seeped into the latex material of the mask, causing the originally bright white surface to take on a distinct yellowish tint that became impossible to ignore. The discoloration wasn't subtle either. By the time the mask was retrieved for filming Halloween 2, it had transformed from the stark pale white that audiences remembered from the first movie into something that looked grimy and aged, almost like it had been left out in the elements for years. The yellowing gave the mask an unintentionally dirty appearance that made Michael Myers look even more unsettling and deteriorated, as if the character himself had been rotting away during the time between the two films. Nobody on the production tried to repaint the mask or restore it to its original color because they actually liked how the yellowed, discolored appearance made the character look more menacing and worn down. The changes caused by Hill's smoking habit ended up contributing to the overall aesthetic of the sequel, where Michael Myers is supposed to be injured and relentless after being shot multiple times at the end of the first film. What could have been seen as damage to an important prop instead became an accidental enhancement that added texture and history to the mask, proving that sometimes the most memorable details in movies come from completely unplanned circumstances rather than carefully calculated design decisions. Fact 8. Nick Castle kept it in his back pocket. Nick Castle, the actor who played Michael Myers in most of the scenes from the original Halloween, had a rather casual habit of dealing with the iconic mask between takes. He would simply fold it up and stuff it into his back pocket whenever he wasn't actively filming. This might seem like a minor detail, but it actually had a significant impact on the condition of the mask throughout the production because the white spray paint that had been applied to transform the original tan-colored kit Captain Kirk mask into the pale, ghostly face of Michael Myers wasn't designed to withstand that kind of constant folding and friction. Every time Castle shoved the mask into his pocket and then pulled it back out again, the paint would rub against the fabric of his pants and gradually wear away, creating bare spots and discolored patches that exposed the original material underneath. The spray paint they had used was just standard paint from a hardware store rather than any kind of professional theatrical makeup or durable coating, so it started flaking off and fading almost immediately under this kind of treatment. By the end of the 3-week shooting schedule, the mask had already begun to look noticeably different from how it appeared at the beginning of filming, with the once uniform white surface now showing signs of wear and deterioration. Castle apparently didn't think much about treating the mask carefully because nobody on set realized at the time that this particular prop would become such an important piece of movie history. It was just another costume element that needed to be available whenever the cameras were rolling. The casual way he handled the mask by cramming it into his pocket demonstrates how low budget and informal the entire production of Halloween really was, with everyone working quickly and practically without any sense that they were creating something that would still be talked about and analyzed decades later. Fact 9. 6 different people played Michael Myers. What most people don't realize when they watch the original Halloween is that the character of Michael Myers was actually portrayed by 6 completely different people throughout the film, with each person handling specific scenes or moments based on what was required for that particular shot. Nick Castle played the masked killer in the majority of the scenes where Michael is stalking victims and walking through shadows, but he wasn't the only person to put on that iconic costume during the production. Tony Moran was brought in specifically for the brief moment at the end of the film when Laurie Strode pulls off Michael's mask to reveal his face, because director John Carpenter wanted someone with a more angelic-looking appearance for that reveal rather than using Castle's face. Tommy Lee Wallace, who was the production designer and the person who actually created and modified the mask, also played Michael Myers in certain scenes, particularly the closet attack sequence where Michael breaks through wooden barriers, because Wallace knew exactly how much force the breakaway props could handle without injuring anyone or ruining takes. Producer Deborah Hill actually wore the costume for a wide exterior shot where young Tommy Doyle sees Michael Myers for the first time and thinks he's spotted the boogeyman, and Hill just happened to have the costume with her that day when no one else was available for that particular shot. Will Sandine played 6-year-old Michael Myers in the opening sequence where he kills his sister Judith, and stuntman James Winburn performed the dangerous fall from the balcony at the end of the film when Dr. Loomis shoots Michael multiple times. The fact that so many different people contributed to creating this one character without audiences ever noticing the switches demonstrates how effective the mask was at creating a unified, faceless presence of evil. Fact 10. Nick Castle was paid only $25 per day. Nick Castle, the man who brought Michael Myers to life in most of the scenes from the original Halloween, earned an astonishingly small amount of money for creating one of the most iconic characters in horror film history. He was paid just $25 per day for his work on the production. To put this in perspective, the entire filming schedule for Halloween lasted approximately 21 days, which means Castle's total payment for playing the role that would define the slasher genre for decades to come was only around $525 for the entire shoot. Castle wasn't a professional actor or stuntman at the time. He was actually a film school friend of director John Carpenter, who had stopped by the set to visit and see how the production was going. Carpenter suggested that Castle play the masked killer instead of hiring someone else to do it, partly because he liked the way Castle moved, and partly because it would save money on the tight budget. Castle agreed to take on the role for what was considered decent daily pay at the time, even though it seems incredibly low by today's standards, especially considering that if you adjust for inflation, his total earnings would only equal around $2,583 in modern currency. What makes this payment even more remarkable is that Castle has said he was perfectly fine with the amount, because, from his perspective, the job was relatively easy. All he had to do was walk around wearing a rubber mask and follow Carpenter's simple direction to move slowly and gracefully without trying to act or show emotion. Castle later joked about his payment, noting that there was one particularly difficult scene filmed in freezing cold conditions with water cannons spraying him while he wore only a hospital gown, and that was the one moment where he thought to himself that maybe he should have asked for more than $25. Fact 11. The coverall's true color is still debated. For more than 4 decades, Halloween fans and costume enthusiasts have argued passionately about what color Michael Myers' coveralls actually are in the original 1978 film, and the debate continues to this day with no clear consensus in sight. Through careful research and examination of vintage Sears catalogs, experts have identified the coveralls as Sears Tradewear brand workwear in a color officially called Tex Green, which was described in the catalog as a gray-green shade. But the problem is that this color appears dramatically different depending on the lighting conditions in each scene throughout the movie. In some scenes, particularly the nighttime sequences where Michael is lurking in shadows, the coveralls look distinctly blue due to the heavy blue lighting that cinematographer Dean Cundy used to create the film's moody atmosphere and give it that classic horror movie look. In other moments, especially outdoor daytime scenes, the same coveralls appear to be charcoal gray or even a smoky greenish-gray color that matches the original Tex Green description from the catalog. There's even a scene where Michael runs into some kids who are bullying Tommy Doyle, and in that particular lighting, the coveralls take on a noticeably greener appearance than anywhere else in the film. This ongoing color confusion has led to decades of arguments among fans who insist the coveralls are blue, others who are absolutely certain they're gray, and still others who maintain they're actually a shade of green. Nick Castle himself, the actor who wore the coveralls for most of the filming, reportedly described them as smoky gray when asked about it years later. But even his first-hand account hasn't settled the debate, because what he remembers seeing in person doesn't necessarily match what appears on screen after all the lighting and film processing was completed. Fact 12. The coveralls date from 1972 or earlier. Dedicated Halloween researchers and costume historians have spent years trying to identify the exact coveralls that Michael Myers wore in the original film, and through careful examination of screen captures and comparison with vintage Sears catalogs, they've made a fascinating discovery about when those coveralls were actually manufactured. The key detail that allowed them to date the coveralls was a subtle but important feature. The collar had a button enclosure rather than the snap enclosure that became standard on Sears Tradewear coveralls in the very early 1970s. By cross-referencing old Sears catalogs from the 1960s and early 70s, researchers determined that the button collar design was phased out and replaced with snap closures right around 1972, which means the coveralls used in Halloween must have been manufactured in 1972 or earlier, making them at least 6 years old by the time filming began in 1978. This discovery raises an interesting question about where the production team actually got these coveralls, because they were using a design that was no longer being sold in stores by that point. The most likely explanation is that the coveralls weren't purchased new for the production at all, but were instead borrowed from someone connected to the crew who happened to own a pair of these older work clothes. Possibly someone who had been wearing them for their actual job for several years before they ended up becoming part of movie history. The fact that the coveralls were already several years old when they were used in the film adds another layer to the authentic, worn-in look that made Michael Myers seem less like a costume and more like a real person who had simply stolen whatever work clothes were available, which perfectly fits the character's practical, opportunistic approach to creating his disguise. Fact 13. Dick Warlock kept the original props. After filming wrapped on Halloween 2 in 1981, the producers made a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, but would come back to haunt them years later. They allowed Dick Warlock, the stuntman who played Michael Myers in the sequel, to keep the entire costume as a memento of his work on the film. Warlock went home with not just the mask, but also the coveralls, the knife, the scalpel, the boots, and basically every single piece of the Michael Myers outfit that had been used throughout both the original Halloween and its sequel. The reason the producers were so generous with letting Warlock take these props was simple. They genuinely believed that Halloween 2 would be the absolute final film in the series and that Michael Myers' story was completely finished. So there was no reason to carefully preserve these items for future use. At the end of Halloween 2, both Michael Myers and Dr. Loomis are caught in a massive explosion at the hospital, and the filmmakers intended this to be a definitive ending where the character was finally killed off for good, which meant the costume pieces were just souvenirs rather than valuable props that would be needed again. However, when Halloween 3 turned out to be a completely different story, with no Michael Myers at all and performed poorly at the box office, the studio decided to bring the character back for Halloween 4 in 1988. That's when the producers realized they had made a serious mistake by giving away the original costume, because now they had to create an entirely new mask from scratch without having the original to reference or copy. This forced decision resulted in the Halloween 4 mask looking noticeably different and receiving heavy criticism from fans who immediately noticed it didn't capture the same blank, emotionless quality of the original. Fact 14. A production mistake. Changed sequel masks forever. The decision to let Dick Warlock keep the original Michael Myers costume after Halloween 2 turned out to be such a costly mistake that it fundamentally changed how the producers handled props for every single sequel that came after. When they started production on Halloween 4 in 1988 and realized they no longer had access to the iconic mask, they were forced to create a completely new one from scratch using another Captain Kirk mask as the base. But the result was dramatically different from what fans remembered and expected. The Halloween 4 mask received immediate and widespread criticism from audiences because it looked nothing like the original. It had a bright white appearance that made it seem almost plastic. The eyebrows were much more prominent. The lips were pursed in a way that made Michael look surprised or confused rather than blank and emotionless. And the overall expression seemed to convey actual human emotion instead of the empty, soulless stare that made the original so terrifying. Fans described the mask as looking shocked, quizzical, or even constipated, and it became one of the most mocked elements of the entire film. After experiencing the backlash over the Halloween 4 mask and realizing how much damage had been done by letting the original costume leave their possession, the producers implemented a strict new policy that would remain in effect for all future sequels. No cast members or crew members were ever again allowed to take home any props from the set, regardless of how minor those items might seem. This policy ensured that the production team would always have access to costumes and masks for potential future films. But it also meant that every subsequent Halloween movie had to use different masks that never quite captured the magic of that original 1978 design, creating an inconsistency across the franchise that fans continue to debate and analyze to this day. Fact 15. Tommy Lee Wallace wore the mask. To Tommy Lee Wallace, the production designer who was responsible for finding the original Captain Kirk mask and transforming it into the iconic Michael Myers look, didn't just work behind the scenes, he also put on the mask and played the killer himself in several important scenes throughout the film. Wallace's unique involvement in playing Michael Myers came from a very practical consideration that had nothing to do with acting ability and everything to do with his intimate knowledge of how the props were constructed and how much physical force they could withstand before breaking. The most notable scene where Wallace performed as Michael Myers was the intense closet attack sequence, where the killer bursts through wooden slats and barriers to get to Laurie Strode while she's desperately trying to hide from him. Because Wallace had personally built or supervised the construction of many of these breakaway props, he knew exactly how hard to hit them to make them splinter and break in a single take without either failing to break through convincingly or hitting them so hard that he might hurt himself or damage the props beyond what was needed for the shot. This kind of multitasking was common on the low-budget Halloween production, where crew members frequently stepped in front of the camera when needed, because there simply wasn't money to hire additional performers for every small role or stunt. Wallace's willingness to wear the costume he had created represents the collaborative, all-hands-on-deck spirit that defined the entire filming experience, where everyone from the producer to the production designer to the director himself was willing to do whatever was necessary to get the shots they needed. Wallace also appeared in another scene where Michael sits up and turns toward Laurie after being knocked down, demonstrating his understanding of how the character should move and presenting a physical performance that other actors later studied and tried to replicate.